Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the fourth seminar in our fellowship series. Today you'll be hearing from Dr. Beth Cardier from Griffith Uni, but let me introduce myself. I think most people already know me. I'm Simon Ng. I'm the Chief Engineer at the Trusted Autonomous Systems Defence CRC. And as many of you will know, we have a fellowship program. We have 4 fellows who work with us at the centre, and we've spent the last 4 months, I think, introducing them to the wider audience. This is a standard format seminar. I will record the whole seminar, so just please bear in mind that it is being recorded. I would ask you to mute yourself in the event that we avoid disruptive background noise, but unmute yourself if you do need to ask a question. And I think there's a raise your hand facility as well. So you can ask questions in the chat room or indeed raise your hand and I'll try and stay on top of that. This should last about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by question time. And the recording will go up onto our YouTube website either today or tomorrow. So let me introduce Dr. Cardier. Dr. Cardier is from Griffith University. She joined us as a fellow about 3 or 4 months ago. She has a wide-ranging background and a very interesting background, and I think that's partly what appealed to us when Beth applied for the fellowship. And what you're going to hear is some really challenging work. Certainly the sort of work that doesn't comfortably fit in the space that I'm used to dealing with, but perhaps you'll be able to tell, you'll get a sense of where that comes from when I tell you a little bit more about Beth. So Beth is an award-winning fiction writer and a media analyst, and she was doing that well before she completed her PhD in creative writing, computing and information systems at the University of Melbourne in 2013. So Beth comes from a very different place from many of the people that the Trusted Autonomous Systems typically deals with. She's had grants from the National Academy's Keck Futures Institute and has also worked as an assistant professor at the Eastern Virginia Medical School. Really interestingly, she's collaborated with Disney Research, which I think is fascinating. I'd love to hear more about that at some point. And she's worked with Keith Devlin, a leading context logician at Stanford University and the Virginia Modeling, Analytics and Simulation Center in the United States. And we now have the pleasure of having her work with the center. So without further ado, what I'll do is I'll hand over to Beth and let me know if everyone can hear it. Beth, over to you. You can flip over to your slides.
It's saying that you have to relinquish your screen
I
share
will do
for
that.
me to join.
I will do that. And it doesn't matter how many times I do this, I still forget exactly what I need to do. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Should be good for you now.
All right. Can you see that?
I can. I'm now going to mute myself and pin your video.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Beth Cardier, and as Simon indicated, I come at this problem from a really interesting background, which I'll explain a bit more in a moment. But first, I want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples, the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm sitting right now. They were fishing nations, and that photo at the bottom is St. Lucia, next to the Brisbane River, which is also very close to where I'm sitting now. And I just sort of wanted to add an extra note that in an age where information can be weaponized, it's more important than ever that we respect and protect the parts of our land in which healthy stories are embodied so they can anchor us. So today I'm going to be talking about 2 things, trust and context, which are not only difficult to define, they're hard to define and hard to formalize. So I think that trust and context are both critical to autonomous systems operating in an open world. And you'll see why I think that as I explain. Let's start with an example. And sort of like a paper cut, I'm just going to run along a range of places in this example where you would need to be able to model context in particular. So say you are in a village and it's, some disaster has occurred, and you want to send your robot in to look for any people who might be still hiding in there, and you're not sure if it's safe for humans to go in. So you want a little autonomous robot. So the first thing is you give it an instruction, and you want it to understand what it is that it is supposed to do. It may need to understand some implicit and situated information. And it gets on its way, and it may encounter some obstacle that's unexpected. And then you need to trust it to make a new plan based on this new context. Now this next instance is similar to the last. There's a new context, but there's also something important about this context which it needs to pay attention to. And finally, you want it to be able to communicate enough about that different situation, that unexpected situation, that the commander can make an appropriate decision. At the next level up, you want all its actions and communication choices to enable you to trust that it's making good decisions. And looking forward in the future, you might want to be able to simulate these properties for gaming or for prediction. So most of what I just spoke about related to context, and I'm going to talk about trust towards the end. So I'm bringing my previous work on modeling context in narrative to model trust and find new ways to unpack what actually goes into trusted interactions, which are sort of dynamic and in the real world. Now, context is famous for being difficult to model. It's got all these human qualities. It doesn't seem to have hard boundaries. And one of the reasons that I think I can bring something new to it is the background that Simon alluded to. So I'm not a scientist. In fact, these things you see on the screen were things that I was doing in my spare time while I was getting undergraduate degrees in creative writing and also English literature. So I am purely focused on the part of modeling in which you adapt to novel circumstances and to an open world. The challenge is showing these things, and I've developed a method. Now, so you don't think I'm just like a crazy hobo off the street. I've done some other things too. I've applied the knowledge of stories in an interdisciplinary fashion to a lot of different things. And some of them I'll explain a bit more later. So let's talk about the way we currently model context. The way that most of the technical people in the audience will be familiar with is as a fixed general reference framework. This is a system of relationships or instructions that are repeatable. And you want it to be repeatable if it's automated, right? This is like the work of Minsky's frames or Shank's scripts, where you might have a sequence of actions that you're familiar with in particular situations that you know should be performed in order to satisfy some objective. And then there is context as we experience it. There is overlays of identity, family relationships, culture, media stories, fears, and we have many contexts operating on us at any given time. It's elusive, it's changing. It was studied by the good people at CSLI at Stanford when they were attempting to solve the context modeling problem for the intelligence community. And they opined that the problem is the task of modeling this kind of context is endless. So the approach that they developed was situation theory, followed by channel theory. That was Barwise, Perry, and Devlin. And they kind of came to a compromise that's much more close to number one than number three, where you switch between general reference frameworks. You might be in a restaurant, but then you might go outside and you needed some sort of different set of instructions for that situation. The thing is that I think we use both. I think it's not a question of one or the other. And the reason I think this is because when I used to edit news articles on scientific discoveries for the newspaper syndicate I worked for, you would have to move between them. You would have to give the audience some general point of reference. And then for the novelty, for the difficult or unexpected idea, you'd have to step them towards it. It's a bit like playing golf, where you do a big swing and you try to get the ball as close as you can, and then you kind of putt away with your, with your other attention to detail and to get the ball in the hole. In fact, this is kind of a useful way to start to pull out the problem of modeling context. So I figured this out when I was working mostly across different forms of narrative communication. And the kind of structures at the top, the general repeatable structures, they use different syntax and structure and level of detail to the elements down the bottom, where you might be communicating with your partner or your best friend. And that just seems to make sense. You have different points of reference, yeah, sure. But the interesting thing is that down in that more personal adaptive communication, the part where you can make a joke or you can decide that a particular song belongs to the two of you, there are different mechanisms at work. There are additional structural machinery that I'm going to try to show you a bit of. Interestingly enough, that I find that a lot of formal modeling methods tend to focus on objects. And it's because you can define them, you can keep track of them easily. And the problem is that if you want to take into account the way that situations change, the way that one thing can turn into another thing, or even if you want to model, someone's state of mind, you have to get further down into the lower left-hand part of the chart. So some qualities from top to bottom. The top areas, the general reference structures are repeatable. The narrative structures can capture what's unexpected. These systems at the top, they need to name everything. Everything that you might need to know about a situation has to already be there. Down the bottom, it acknowledges that there is a limited view. You only know a small amount about the world at any given time, and what you have instead are adaptive mechanisms to cope with that. So why would we care about getting down into the bottom left when it's so hard? Well, one reason is because we really want to know what's going to happen next. So in order to model causality, in order to understand how causality, those sorts of associations work, you need to get down into a subjective space. And here's why. So in the 1700s, philosopher David Hume figured out and wrote a great treatise on the way that we cannot formally model an objective perspective on cause. And the problem is that, as far as he was concerned, the names were always changing. The position that you had on something might not be the one that discerns what is causing what, and you can't keep track of individual units because a boy becomes a man or a school becomes a hospital. And the interesting thing about context in a fluid reality, in any one of the sort of disrupted environments that you might want to send a robot because it's too dangerous for a human to go, it's very likely that there are influences occurring in there that you cannot completely name or could not anticipate based on what you can see in one moment for the next. So along came these two lawyers in 1986, and they did a big survey of all the causality literature, and there's a lot, and it goes across a lot of fields. And their goal was to find out how to properly define cause in a legal context. So they figured out that the context matters. What you're doing in a court of law is you are jostling to try to make your frame of reference the dominant one. And here's an example. So say you have a nice watch and you hit it with a hammer and the glass breaks, and you assume that the cause of the break is the hammer. But what if you're in a watchmaking factory and there is a hammer that's hitting every single watch face, and only one of them breaks? Well, in that case, you assume that the causal agent is the flaw in the glass. So it comes up in narrative theory as well, this notion of a background and foreground. It also comes up in relation to B-frame compression, where the information that you want to keep track of is the one that is changing and diverging from your point of reference. So that little module explaining how causality emerges from a background and how context is important to that is unfortunately not the whole story. That is actually just a part of the narrative system, the system in which we figure out how to communicate unexpected events. Again, across many fields, narrative has been noted to have this quality of divergence. The reason to tell a story is that something has happened which does not fit the regular routine. A story that entirely consisted of regular routine would be pretty dull. And within that telling, the nugget that someone is getting out of that story is they are making a model. They are modeling anew how this unexpected situation changes their sense of what can happen. You can see it even in the very first sentences of well-written works. So, for example, we've got metamorphosis, and the equation, the correlation between waking up one day and finding out that you're a monstrous insect, and the emotional problems that go along with that, and enables the writer to talk about, difficult relationships with family and with oneself. And that thing that he's noticing, what do you see? How is it connected? Is there from the very beginning. The thing about a limited scope is that you have to be really selective about what you're naming. And the one of the ways that narrative operates is it has a contract with you that the things that it names are going to be relevant somehow to this changing world. So if there's only one thing that you get out of the idea of narrative that I'm presenting here, is that it's going to show you in this context, which is perceived from a limited stance, what causal structure are we in and how is it changing? So how might one represent this? Well, I started with a general ontology representation. This is that general reference framework, that repeatable template that I referred to earlier. And I thought, what is the equivalent in stories? So Little Red Riding Hood, the most famous version, has been around for 300 years. And Wikipedia is another example of shared knowledge. So the example of Red Riding Hood there on Wikipedia is pretty general. It's a system of relationships that we're all familiar with. There's a girl and a wolf and a grandmother that gets eaten. But if you compare it to a much more disruptive version of this story, this was written in America before America joined the Second World War, then even by the second sentence, the structure, the causal logic of this story has changed completely. So the goal, if trying to understand how this works, is to see how do you get from the first state to the second state. So I use relationships and nodes like everyone else, but also I'm going to add contextual containers. So when we in communication refer to something, usually we are just drawing on a couple of key elements of it. We don't need to pull out the entire, ontology of something. We're referring, if I say Red Riding Hood, you've got a gist of what that means. And below that, I've got a layer. So in process models, that is sometimes called a swim lane, and that allows me to show processes over time. If I've got boundaries around certain conceptual structures that I'm using, I'm going to need to cross that boundary. So this funnel is drawn from channel theory, but also simply from common sense, that if you've got a lot of context, you need to show how information is being transferred between them. So here's where it starts to get sticky. If you're moving between different frames of reference, which all have a limited perspective on the world and may name different things, then you're going to get misalignment, which creates ambiguity and uncertainty. So I have a way to register possible interpretations that we may not be sure of yet. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of activity going on in this weaving between different states. So I needed to show when one was acting on another and when that process had finished. And I'm laying it out on a layout very similar to the one that I showed at the beginning, where you've got very general references at the top. And as you go, you keep pulling out subset context or bringing in new context as points of reference. So at the bottom, again, there's a background and a foreground. There's another transition mechanism that's sort of important, and I'll mention it in case people who are following Ted's work are here watching today. So you've got the individual level and you've got the system level, and there are two different identities there. The wolf in the first context means one thing. The wolf in this other context means something completely different. It's a foil for a dictator. And so the identity or the signature of the system level context that you're in will change the interpretation of the tokens within it. And the good thing about this is that if you've got these two levels of identity, then interpretation can switch tracks when one cannot persist. And in stories, you know of that as analogy. This could be something like a frame or a script, or something even quite simple. And in Ted's work, it's category theoretic structure, or some other equivalent mathematics. And the idea is that you preserve structure between situations, even if the syntax is different. So here's an example. I'm not going to just let it run all the way through because it would take a long time. But for every new incoming piece of information, you're trying to figure out if the last context that you had can support it. And if it can't, you pull out a new one. So this is kind of an account keeping in which, as the information keeps coming in, you try to determine whose causal framework is dominant. The flashes of blue indicate influence. So at the end of this story, we discover that it's the dictator's terms that the story is unfolding on. He sounds a bit like other populist leaders at the moment, this dictator, where he blames everything on Red Riding Hood and the grandmother, and it's the grandmother's fault that she got eaten because she surprised him. So the blue flashes indicate over the period of how this tale unfolds, how those causal priorities end up being inherited by all the other structures being introduced. Now, that is the answer to the question, how do you get from one state to the next? That is the agent. It's really complicated. I think structures like this that deal with novelty could help to represent grey zone negotiations, prediction, social media interactions, all of the things listed here. One of the interesting things about getting down low in that chart, down into the more adaptive area of communication and reasoning, is that the implicit structure becomes more important because it's the way you're connecting up the different frames of reference that matters almost as much or perhaps more than the syntax itself. So something like grey zone, where you have competitive and collaborative partners, and you have a lot of ambiguity and things that are unspoken, this would be the method that I would conceive of to think about that problem. So let's look at the bottom. I see trust as the next level up from this kind of diagramming method. And I'm just at the beginning of this fellowship, but I do have some work so far where I've brought that method into the trust space to figure out what that looks like. So if I was looking at collaborative relationships, then I would put human trust all the way down on the left there. But there are a lot of different ways that we refer to concepts like trust. We've got reliance, we've got assurance, and I think these fall on different depths of this spectrum. And to the extent that we might be able to rely on the machine and we know for what it's supposed to do, then we will be able to trust it. So I just want to sort of reassure Simon and Kate that, you know, we don't have to go all the way down into the deep left-hand side here. That I think that there's a lot that can be discovered in these upper layers. Now I'm finding that I'm starting to get to the limits of my tool. I don't even know if you're going to be able to read this thing that's unfolding right now because the text had to be so small to fit everything in. But something that I am interested in about trust at the moment is that it's meta. It's not enough just to know that you can rely on something. You probably want to know that it knows what it's supposed to be doing, and you communicate back to it that you agree that that's what it's supposed to be doing. So in fact, there are sort of layers of trust. And I wanted to be able to demonstrate the moments of alignment that occur, because I think that this sense of dependence or being able to be vulnerable in terms of allowing a machine to do an important task depends on understanding that your plan for what's going to happen matches its plan for what's going to happen. In this interaction, which I wouldn't expect you to read on such a small font, we've got a person who says something and the robot makes an appropriate response. And then the human indicates it understands that the robot has made an appropriate response. And then the robot makes a joke based on that exchange. And so here in this very simplistic example, I have in green that a connection, a thin little thread of trust that forms between the competence that the robot initially displayed, and it's become cemented by the fact that it could make a joke about it. And I wanted to be able to include any other thing that populated that interaction, because from the human side, we tend to build all kinds of things into our narratives, whether we know it or not. So I'm looking to explore the way trust is emergent. Each one of these little threads through a workplace interaction builds up into a network that you could probably name trust. But the ability to distinguish between trust that is applied to one situation versus another. For example, I trust my brother to drive me to the airport, but not to fly the plane. To be able to distinguish between different contexts and different capabilities, I think could be really important, because it also allows you to study what happens when competence fails. Is the trust eroded in just a few places, or is the break more fundamental? So that would also give you some clues about what communication is needed and what kind of repair is needed. So I've already complained once or twice about the limits of my tools. And if you are trying to represent things that are beyond what usually are trying to be represented, you need new formats in which to represent them. So this is a tool that I developed in the United States with VMask, and it was solving the problem of the fact of trying to fit all those little tiny nodes on a two-dimensional keynote screen. Actually, there should be networks that go on infinitely. And the nice thing about that tool, you can't see it in that picture, was that from the inside, it looked like I was on an endless bare planet all by myself. Interestingly, though, I think that meaning forms in relation to some kind of boundary. So the next iteration of the tool would be different. It would move between restricted and kind of limitless formats. So here's something that I would like to represent, and it would need a more powerful representation platform to do that. The first example I'm going to study is post-traumatic stress disorder, not necessarily this part of it. I'm going to look at the communication part. What's interesting about post-traumatic stress disorder, which I have had, is that it is the way the world would be for all of us if we didn't have these contextual boundaries on our reasoning. You know, you live every moment like this is the moment in which you are going to die, which is ultimately the end of our story. But we can't act appropriately. Our body can't respond appropriately in the day-to-day, you know, just when we're pouring milk on our cereal, if we think that we're going to die. PTSD is sort of interesting for its, what I think of as its signature. So the labels that I've chosen here, I chose them. You know, in some sense that's arbitrary. The format I've made, in some sense that's arbitrary too. But one thing that would be there, no matter what the format was, is some sort of representation of this big yellow colored black hole in the middle of the page. PTSD is unusual because it's recursive. Everything is related to the same frame of reference. The door slamming is a car crash. The balloon popping is a car crash. And so you end up with this quite distinctive, unhealthy structure. If there were more nodes, if I could make a, you know, populate this on my planet, you would see everything crumpling in towards this kind of center. Now, I think it could be interesting for information processes that we can't directly see, or maybe can't even, you know, explicitly read or understand, that you might be able to detect when there was something disordered about an information system. Even, you know, social media. I think fascism or a sort of inordinate amount of influence on social media might look something like this too. Everything comes back to the same agent, the same frame of reference. In a healthy narrative system, because there's new information constantly coming in from the world, you're constantly throwing guy ropes out to new frames of reference, and you're adapting the information that you had before to the new situation. So that's what a healthy narrative system looks like. This structure and having some kind of sense of these structures is important, because it's not enough just to capture, a bunch of pictures of what's out there. Here's a sequence of images that I pulled out of the news on the American Black Lives Matter protests from earlier in the year. And I can tell a story from these 3 images that the protesters gathered. They were attacked by police, and then there was some sort of reconciliation. I could watch a different news network and I could see a completely different story for the same place and the same dates. So you need to be keeping track of structures of influence so that you can understand how to read a situation. So in this tableau here, this threat of the military on the protesters might be like the situation in Sudan in 2019, where protesters were killed by an unidentified military. Or this could be like the protests in the US in Charlottesville, where one group of protesters decided to harm another group. Or it could be like Timothy McVeigh that decided to blow up some government buildings. We are always only going to have partial information, no matter how much we gather. And if you have some sort of structure that you are able to read, you might figure out that the information you need to know is down here. And this is important because you want to characterize situations accurately so that if you intervene on them, your intervention is appropriate. In terms of some more local applications, orientation with autonomous vehicles and understanding when some kid is likely to jump out from a curb in front of you, identifying objects based on past and surrounding states. Is it a tank or is it a farmhouse? Or anticipating crowd behavior, figuring out where the aggressive impetus is coming from. And sometimes you might need to look at news media in order to figure that out as well. So I'll be working on some of these things, and with these partners watching over my shoulder. The connection with bionics is that it is the closest human-machine collaboration. I'm also doing some other projects within TAS, and I believe some of those people are watching. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, Beth. Really, really interesting. So we have about 15 minutes. I have a couple of questions, but I thought maybe I'd open it up to comments or questions from the floor first. Anyone wants to ask anything, just unmute yourself and ask away.
I sort of have I actually took some notes, and unfortunately, I've got about 20 questions, I think.
Darren, maybe what I'll do is get people to introduce themselves as well, just so that we...
Okay. I'm Darren Reed, Principal Scientist from DST. The one I want to sort of pick out is probably, I'll put it this way, what if the tool doesn't know what you don't know about what it doesn't know? Now, I sort of pose that as a bit of an illustrative question, because what I ended up thinking about was handling cyclic structures. And as soon as you start to look at cyclic logical sort of structures in a situation like this, then the next step my mind goes to is, well, what are the fixed points associated with those structures, which I think is what you were really getting to, and I think this is spot on. That's kind of what emergence looks like. That's really what emergence amounts to. So I just sort of wonder, in terms of where this approach might go, how directly sort of playing with and embodying cyclic logical relationships in things, what that might look like.
So when you say cyclic, are you referring to the sort of the preserved category theoretic structure, or are you talking about that kind of recursive thing that happens in PTSD?
Both. Well, in fact, I don't think that they're sort of distinct. But let's go with the category theoretic kind of approach. I think that provides kind of a framework within which you can sort of then look at inductive, co-inductive versus irreducibly paradoxical recursive kind of type structures, which when you mentioned Hume's 1752 paper, that's sort of what he was playing with, but he didn't have the maths to really kind of explore it. So I just sort of pulled that out as a little bit of a thread underneath there. So I just wonder what those cyclic structures might look like and how to approach them.
So if you're talking, so one of the things that you raised was what can it offer us? And if I understood correctly in terms of the piece of the machine that you're asking about, so it enables you to cross the barriers. So there are models of narrative that I've made where sometimes in order to get across two contexts, join two dissimilar contexts, you need some kind of analogical structure. I think of it as analogical, but you probably think of it as some sort of category theoretic structure. And the reason you need that is because the words have changed. So, there's an example in Guardians of the Galaxy where you see, a little boy, his mother dies, and he blocks out the terrible reality of it by listening to daggy 70s music on his Walkman. And then you get to be landed in a planet on the other side of the universe with a grown man who's kicking little alien dinosaurs. And he puts the Walkman on his head, and all of a sudden we've got a match. So we know many things about that. We know that the boy is also the man. We know that he was transported on a spaceship to a planet on the other side of the universe and survived long enough to kick alien dinosaurs. There's so much inference that we get from that one object, which is sort of an anchoring tangible artifact of a history and of the causal structure or the causal associations that go with that object. And so for as long as that analogy can persist, we can keep using that as a point of reference. I was talking about the newspaper article or the golf hole. It's the wide shot that brings everyone with you a really long distance before you get into the nitty gritty. I think that's what that structure affords you.
Yeah, it's a fixed point. Now that's really interesting because the other thing which you've touched on now, so I'm happy with that, is really about the need for multi-level abstraction and the layering of narratives or embedding of narratives. And I think that's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, because you're always going to have the trouble that you're moving between scales. If you're looking at one thing following another thing, you're going to bump out of the abstracted scale that you are comfortable in at some point. And so you have to have a way to move between whether it's scales or even times, right? So, it's the same in the temporal direction as well. So you need a way to be able to cross those barriers, and the names are going to change. Some of the names will change, some won't. And that's what's also an affordance of narrative structure, that you get to follow some parts of the syntax and structure for a certain way while others change. And if you're doing it well, you'll alternate so that not everything's changing at the same time.
Thanks, Darren. Kate, you've got your hand raised.
I do, mate. I do. Beth, lovely talk. I'd like to ask you about your thoughts. I'm really interested in the approach you're taking with the post-traumatic stress disorder. And you made some comments around the idea that you've got this dysfunctional tendency with that experience of associating everything with one context, like the door slamming, it reminds you of the trauma. And I think this ties into sort of normative ideas of psychopathology, which is to say, there are some human thought conditions that can be really maladaptive in certain situations and very adaptive in other situations. So autism spectrum disorder, they've found that a lot of difficulty with metaphor in those spectrum disorder conditions, a difficulty in multitasking and some difficulties with metaphor. And it seems to be neurologically based in terms of a lack of ability for messages to go across contexts, for there to be a kind of this maybe holistic appreciation of a scene or a scenario. But those type of abilities to cordon off or silo interpretation could be really useful in some situations. So I'm just thinking in autonomous systems and robotic platforms, if you're trying to model the sort of optimized, psychology of a robotic system, and you're looking at human forms of thought, do you have sort of thoughts where you're like, well, in some situations you want to be able to dissociate, or in some situations you'd like to be a certain type of way, and whether that's informing your approach to your research?
Yeah, so I would love to study Asperger's. I have family members who are Asperger's, and probably I'm on the spectrum myself. So there's also in terms of social interactions, I perceive that myself and my Asperger's kin will often lack, all of the structure that some other person might have in terms of social interactions. And so, if I'm organizing a birthday party for my kid, I kind of put it there by brute force. I'm like, okay, so I have to talk to people. Yeah, I'll start with that. And so there's you don't infer it automatically from your environment growing up. You kind of have to put it all in there. In terms of harnessing particular neurological diversities for particular tasks, yeah, I think there's a role for that. So if you want something explained to you about the mechanics of something, you would want my 9-year-old Asperger's kid to do it for you. So he will be exhaustive, he will be patient, he will not miss anything. So I think that in some contexts, taking the barrier off, our natural inclination towards quick summary, and the easy tokens that go back and forth in conversation could be really useful. And, from the disordered perspective, it helps make more visible the kinds of affordances that are there in different directions. So what happens when you take this away? What happens when you take this away? I noticed in lockdown, when you don't leave your house for a long time, there's this kind of tunneling that happens simply because the simple back and forth with other people that kind of grounds you somehow. It gives you like a sort of a very simple common point of reference. So I noticed that kind of happening when we were in our 4th month. So yeah, I very interested in looking at that aspect of where the work could go.
Thank you.
Beth, Simon here. Great talk. Really interested in the PTSD a little bit like Kate. I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but the bubble you drew on your PTSD graph looks like a gun. And either it was a sort of a subtle statement or it's just sheer coincidence, but it was interesting nonetheless. You speak about signatures, and I guess as a physicist, there's a sort of transcendent power in models, and you're pointing to the fact that what you're doing is at some level revealing kind of the topology of context or of comprehension of context, and obviously that's derived from a connection between the visible world, the perceptions you have and the kind of associations you make when you interact with those perceptions. But are you starting to see this kind of emergence of signatures in the way that you use that term, that is sort of characteristic topologies in these narratives that tell you something about the narrative that's in some ways above the level of the individual nodes and the individual connections?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you are a practicing storyteller, what you have is a very blurry sense of what that signature may be, what this kind of overall perspective is. In fact, in the NACFI project, something I had wanted to do with the Italian fashion designer who was, paired with the neurologist that I was working with, was eventually have him stylize or see more into those metastructures than my sort of clunky node link drawings. And that's still possible. It's just developing a representational method that I can hand to him. So I do, it's a little bit, on the other, calligraphic. If you do it looking at calligraphy, the style in which something is presented will tell you something about the meaning of the word that goes beyond the actual syntax of the word itself. And so I thought of it as a shorthand, but also to address the really hard problem of how does a robot come back and tell you something that you weren't expecting, so you couldn't program the language into it. So a process of making analogies of the golf ball that you hit. Well, it's this kind of situation, but there are these things in it. Even if you're, say, dealing with an autonomous system that doesn't have those sorts of communicative abilities. I had this fantasy about, a little nano autonomous system that might be able to go into your body and understand what was causing your cancer, because it used some sort of machine learning or some sort of special thing that I couldn't keep track of. But if it discovers an answer that's not already in the medical vocabulary, how is it going to tell you? So it is a nice idea for quickly reading a situation, but it also might be kind of critical if you're in the position of having a machine that needs to tell you something that neither of you had anticipated before it went off and did its work.
Other questions from the floor? I have another question, but I don't want to hog the limelight. Anyone else, or comments?
I'm going to just a comment. This is one of the things that when I read the sort of the distribution, the short description for the distribution for the talk, I was kind of thinking, absolutely agree that context is everything. I mean, this falls out of a view of pure mathematics. It's sort of spread all the way through pure mathematics, but it's not really something that's often really appreciated enough. And then I kind of thought about it, given the narrative flavour of it, I was thinking, well, the language is part of that context too. So it's not just the context of problem solving, in a sort of a topological sense. It's the language is part of the infrastructure of the problem itself. And I think you've only just reinforced that thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as far as I draw it, it's the semantics, it's the associative patterns that go with them, it's the points of reference that you may use, and it's the depth of the machinery as well. So, you don't have to have a system that can babysit your child. You couldn't have, I think, trust at all of those other levels of reliance, whatever, as long as everyone's on the same page about the task that needs to be done. So the further you go down into, that kind of situated, contextual, perceptive area, the more machinery you need. And you may not need that, all of it. You might just be able to get away with some of it. So just as we do in day-to-day life, often we use shorthands and we don't go into the rigorous explanation, of exactly how we feel about something. For different tasks and different, workplace scenarios, you may not need all of the infrastructure, but you might need some. And I think essentially, if you're going to put something in an open world, you are going to need some kind of representation of context. And it could be as simple as the situation theory, switching between different scenarios. But as long as you've got that, more than one layer of abstraction there, because otherwise the minute something unexpected happens, you're going to be stuck because the words run out, the names run out,
It kind of seems, sorry, Simon here again, it seems to me, Beth, that we have this kind of chasm. The reason we as people can sit around and sort of share an understanding and interpret a context in a consistent way is because we have a lifetime of associations that are built up through largely the same experiences, right? There's nuances in those experiences, but we all know parents, we all know relationships, we all know home, we all know, so we have this kind of, and I'm using the term loosely, and Ted might jump in and yell at me. We have all these kind of, category theoretic things in our head already, and we draw those analogies very rapidly, and we can interpret analogy. But when it comes to robotic systems or autonomous systems, they don't have that scaffolding, and that's not how we currently develop them. We very much engineer them around frames, as you put it. We very much engineer them around concrete, defined, explicit models of the world, but we don't grow them in the way that we grow people. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on whether that basically presents an insurmountable gap between people and machines that will mean that we'll never fully have that kind of ability to establish trust in the way that we establish trust with people, or indeed establish a shared understanding of a problem or a shared understanding of an intention?
Well, you don't need it to be 100% shared, though, is the thing, right? So, I'm coming from the human-human relationship place, and I'd meant to mention this, so I'm glad you brought this up. But the human-machine relationship is different, because we know that the machine is built differently. And I do think you're going to need the machine to be able to present to you what it thinks its model is, and be able to communicate that to you, so you can affirm, yes, that's what you need to do. So, if it has any kind of, important responsibility, you'll need that. But something that I think is going to be interesting as my work progresses is to look at how it's not the same as the human-human interaction, the human-robot interaction. Some theorists say that, the trust process is inverted. You don't do the global first and think, oh yeah, you seem like a good guy, and then drill down. You go, can you perform this one thing properly? Oh yeah, okay, well then I'll give you the benefit of the doubt a little bit. So that sort of, inversion will probably be part of the back and forth. But in a sense that, the method I have is a bit agnostic, in the same way that, a socially stunted person can organize a really killer kid's birthday party, that what you would be looking at then is, well, are there additional adaptive mechanisms that you need to cross over back and forth? Is there something additional that we need to include in the interaction so that we can reduce ambiguity, or we can reduce uncertainty? And at the same time, you might, have some sort of fledgling mental model, or a shared work plan model that you make sure that the robot is developing in tandem with the task, so it can be referred to. So I can see different levels of solving that problem, depending on how autonomous you want your embodied intelligence system to be.
Is it possible to ask a question?
Yeah, we have time for one last question, so go ahead.
So, I couldn't put up my hand. I don't know where to. Sorry about that. So Beth, how do you see the possibility of even these funnels or these channels are actually a bit lossy if we look at the actual mathematics of it? But there might be an opportunity in there, is to actually being able to learn new situations.
Yeah, for sure. It would be, the possibility of a machine discovering a situation that you hadn't anticipated would give us a new situation. Lossiness in poetics, if directed properly, creates some beautiful ambiguity. And the third thing about those funnels, what they actually are swim lanes of their own. They are little mini models of their own, but I cannot draw that with a keynote. So you would possibly be able to keep track, to a better degree than the little orange squiggle does, where the loss is, where it's occurring, because you'd be able to see what's aligning and what's not as things, as the information transfers between contexts.
Thanks, Beth, for a really, really interesting talk and an interesting discussion. And thanks everyone for joining in. Just advertising our next seminar, which is on Thursday, the 19th of November, 1 o'clock Brisbane time, 2 o'clock Australian Eastern Daylight Time. And the talk has been given by Associate Professor Iman Shames from University of Melbourne and Dr. Rob Hunjett from DST, who also happens to be an Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales. The title is Instinct, Reasoning and Education, the Future of Trusted Autonomous Systems. I'm going to talk very specifically about how you can develop autonomous systems that are verifiable by design. So there's a little link in the chat. Jump on that and join in. And otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this. And thank you again, once again, Beth, for putting on such an interesting talk.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye all.
We